Good evening. It's so nice to see everyone here. My name is Sabrina Starneman, and I would like to welcome you to the second talk in this year's series for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. Tonight we have a wonderful speaker, Greg Bear, and we are very thankful for the good work of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Club here at UTD. They have been very helpful and helped sponsor this event. Greg will give his talk, and then if you don't mind holding your comments and questions until the end, we'll have time to do that. At this point, I would like to introduce our Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, Dennis Gratz.
Good evening. Welcome to the latest lecture in the Incite Your Curiosity series and our continuing ambition to bring every really great science fiction writer to Richardson. A few words about the Center for Values. Is this the first trip to a Center for Values lecture for any of you? Okay, good. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Greg, you've brought a good crowd. Thank you. The Center for Values is a very important, I think, essential part of the University of Texas at Dallas. If you know UT Dallas, you know that it's a university focused on, which is a nicer word than obsessed with, science and engineering and leadership and research and science and education and the engineering, and also with its sister down just south of here, University of Texas Southwest Medical Center, to leadership and research and excellence in medicine. Well, it's our view that if you have an aspiration to leadership in research and education in science and engineering and medicine, you should have a corollary aspiration to excellence and depth in thinking about why we do our research in science and engineering and medicine. What are the values that drive us? What are the implications for society and culture and our individual lives with the advances that science and technology bring? So that's what this series is about. This series is about thinking through the advances of science and technology. Now, our speaker today is a writer about the implications of science and technology for human life. Greg Bear, I looked up his bibliography, and it's like thick. And what's fascinating about it is it's mostly a list of books he's written. How many have read a book or a story by Greg Bear? Okay. How many own a computer, an iPhone, or other smart device? Good. You've probably, and if you haven't, you can look up his bibliography and his biography and do it quicker than I can do it. Suffice to say, he's written many, many books. He was born in San Diego. The first thing on his bibliography, he's completed his first short story at age 10, and has continued to write for what now is another 15 or 20 years. Has written some of the best science fiction I've read. Blood Music, which I present to every class I teach in science or science fiction, and both moves and creeps out people in just the right way. Darwin's Radio and other books show him to be a master of thinking through ideas in a powerful narrative. Greg Bear. One more thing, I mentioned his books, and I was told to remind you, said books, many are on sale outside after the lecture. Thank you.
Actually, can you hear me with just this microphone? Yeah. Okay, so let's turn this off so we don't get there. Hope that works. So you still hear me? Yes. Very good. Well, I wanted to thank you all for inviting me here. This is a great treat and a great honor to come back to Texas, because when I was a kid, I claimed I was born here. We lived in Corpus Christi. My father was a naval meteorologist, and we moved to Corpus Christi back in the 1955 or thereabouts, and I was 4 years old, and I just loved Davy Crockett and the Alamo and everything, and being from California was kind of boring, so I says, no, I was born in Texas, to anyone who asked. That was so cool to be born in Texas. Now, since then, I've seen a lot of scary movies, and I first saw some of those scary movies, I believe, here in Texas. Might have included King Kong. My dad took me to some of these things. Might have been Moby Dick. I have vague memories of these things at the age of 4. And that kind of got me thinking about storytelling and so on. By the time I was 8 or 9 years old, it was pretty confirmed that I wanted to tell stories. But there was something else going on there, too. One, a total lack of discipline. I wanted to study what I wanted to study, and I didn't know what that was, and I don't think anybody else did either. And so my entire educational career was basically plucking the fruit that were hung out in front of me that I thought were appropriate and leaving the green apples on the tree for later, in some cases, for later. But along the way, I was evaluated as a mathematical genius, which I wasn't, which shows you what the school system in California was like at the time, very optimistic. But I was pretty good at certain things, like manipulating geometrical objects in my head and that sort of stuff, and I still do that to this day. When it comes to algebra, forget it, equations. But I'm a word nerd. If I'm not so much a math nerd, I'm definitely a word nerd. And all of those things flooded me when I started reading science fiction. I started off reading Tom Swift and that sort of stuff, and ended up reading Robert Heinlein, and then moving on and reading everybody else. And by the time I was 14 years old, I was a very confirmed science fiction fan, watching all the movies. I wanted to do writing, I wanted to tell stories, I wanted to make movies, I wanted to do special effects, I was doing artwork, illustration, and if I'd had any musical bent, I would have been a composer too. So I was doing all that stuff at once, all my horses tearing me apart in different directions. No wonder some of the teachers couldn't quite figure out what I was up to, and I didn't either, and I still haven't. So when I started putting down the thoughts for this idea today, it was basically, how many are pre-med here? Oh my! Here, we got a couple, okay. My thought was, I'm the worst patient a doctor could possibly have, because I have a lot of crackpot theories about medicine and biology. And the worst thing of all is that I've been proven correct in a number of them, and there's nothing worse than a crackpot who's halfway right. That confirms the bent, and suddenly you're talking to your doctor as if you're a co-equal. Well, I do not think I'm a co-equal with someone who's gone through medical school. But along the way, as I've studied all of this stuff, and written science fiction and done research in the sciences and talked to scientists, which is essential when you're writing science fiction, starting back in the late 1970s, maybe even in the late 1960s, I came up with some notions of biology that weren't standard. And I asked questions that weren't the normal questions. Like I asked a question when I was writing the story Blood Music. I have it in a notebook somewhere. It says, what do viruses do for us? And this was in the early 1980s. And we were just beginning the whole discovery of what retroviruses do against us in the 1980s, but retroviruses weren't supposed to be able to do that because that was against dogma. The dogma of biology of the time was that you have DNA writes to RNA writes to protein and never the reverse, never. So when you had Howard Temin come along with his notion of retroviruses, which were viruses that write back to DNA, verboten, couldn't be done. And so he was denied by the medical communities, and that stopped us from understanding how HIV works for about 10 or 15 years. We would have been 10 or 15 years more advanced had we not had that dogma that says what you're describing is philosophically impossible, which of course it wasn't. Philosophy is a pretty solid thing when you come to science, and it wasn't. It wasn't physically impossible, it happened. So the dogma shattered. And as I watched this happening, I told myself, there's something else going on here. All of these dogmas are suspicious. Why do scientists have dogmas? That's supposed to be a religious problem, right? Why do we have to face these notions of what can and cannot be done based on artificial premises and sometimes even medieval prejudices? Turns out that many scientists have prejudices that go back at least to the 14th century. about the role of humanity and the nature, all of this stuff. They echo what's going on in religion quite often. And I find that a fascinating back and forth because they're supposed to stare daggers at each other. Why are they behaving so much alike? Why do you have patriarchal scientists and doctors and biologists telling us we can't do these things? So I was researching blood music because my editor said, you've got to get this right. You got to prove to me before I buy the story that this is practical. So I went down and studied the genetics, the DNA, the amounts of DNA that were available to do this and that, and wrote the story and sold it to the editor, and it did okay. So that got me going down the road to where Arthur Koestler was going. And Arthur Koestler, back in the late 1960s, mid-1960s, was very skeptical about evolution, as currently described. He says, this just doesn't make sense. Everything is based upon randomness, and there is no, design or anything like that. That doesn't make any sense at all. Of course, they were going up against the religious problem of intelligent design, which was something outside of the biological system. The in-between description, as turns out, is true, which is internal design. And that's where I headed when I continued to do my research. As I went to doctors over the years, I realized that doctors have the opportunity to study biology on the hoof, so to speak. They are watching the great wildebeest herds cross the plains of Africa and studying all of their dynamics, and all of the patients that come before them have these things. And if the doctor is a little curious, the doctor will notice trends that are not supported by the current dogmas in medicine and biology. The doctor becomes a frontline participant in science then, but doctors really aren't allowed to do this. Doctors can't do this. They can't do research on you, and well, they're not supposed to anyway, right there in the doctor's office, because there's a regimentation here that is in fact useful. You need to maintain the discipline, but that doesn't mean you've got to stop watching and observing. So when I went to my dentist back in the 1990s, I says, in a few more years, very likely you're going to be transferring the bacteria from healthy patients' teeth to the bacteria, to replace the bacteria in patients who are having gum disease and all that other stuff. You'll do bacterial transplants because probiotic therapy was already being used for certain things back then. And now I didn't take it as far as it's gone now. Now fecal transplants, my God, who could have imagined that? But it works. And it works against some very, very difficult bacteria. It turns out that the doctor is observing, as a human being and as a doctor, the biology and the sociology of medicine and the sociology of biology. From top to bottom, all of biology shares a common trait, which is it has to survive in a tough environment on very little information and minimal resources. Top to bottom. If you're a student, you know what that means. If you're a politician, you know what that means. If you're looking for a grant for your medical research or your scientific research, you know what that means. If you're a paramecium, you know what that means. You head into the nutrients and away from danger, but you can't always tell. So your system is set up to maximize your beneficial responses, your survival responses, under tough conditions, but cannot guarantee that you will always survive or you always prosper. But that's what you're set up to do, is to look for the right opportunities, the right situations, the right set of nutrients, grant money, all that stuff. Top to bottom, politics is biology. Economics is biology. Human behavior is biology. All of that became increasingly clear to me, in a sense, beginning with reading Arthur Koestler, who was asking all of these questions. The case of the midwife toad, he says, well, this guy fudged it. He faked his results, but what was he discovering? What was he pointing towards? Here's what we should look for in evolution. Here's what we should be discussing. And we're not. And he was right. Not completely, but he pushed me in the right direction. So asking, what do viruses do for us? Well, the standard thing about medicine back in the 70s and 80s, and even before that, not for all doctors certainly, but for a great many, was it's nature red of fang and claw. It's us against them. It's bacteria being bad, it's viruses being bad, it's you being their warrior ground, your battleground, and we have to deal with that. Kill all bacteria if necessary. Viruses, we don't know how to kill them, but now we're getting better at it. So what a radical idea. What do viruses do for us? In 1908, there was a major discovery, which was a minor discovery, which was that if you put a certain kind of larva for an insect, a phantom midgefly larva, in a tank full of water fleas or daphnia, the Chaoborus larvae were very heavy-duty predators. And they would take and change the water somehow, smell, whatever, so the daphnia would know they were there, and the daphnia would create a generation of children that had heavier armor. They looked so different, they could have been a different species. And that would continue for as long as the Chaoborus was there, generation to generation. It was an instant physiological change in terms of geological time, and it was an adaptation to a changing environment. Now, that in 1908 should have been really startling, because that really knocks the pins out from under the notion that the only evolutionary change that can occur is gradual and random. Because here was a species creating children right away to respond to predators in the water. And then when the predators go away, because it's more expensive to make these children with their heavier shells, the shells go back. What the heck was that about? It was a reversible process. We find out now that stick insects can create wings and go and lose wings in a little more time than that, but nevertheless, they keep doing it. They've done it hundreds of times. Okay? How does that happen? How can you have a random thing responding to an environment where the stick insect finds it beneficial to have wings, and then the wings go away? This all started really bugging me, and I was reading Lynn Margulis, lovely biologist, lovely woman, who came up with the notion that bacteria were the ones who created our mitochondria, became our mitochondria when they inhabited our cells at some point. Mitochondria have many relations with bacteria. They have their own gene selections. Sometimes those genes are written back into our DNA, so the mitochondria are minimal genetically, but we find their genes in our own DNA. All this mixing and matching is going on. What the heck is that about? How can that be if nature is red of fang and claw and there's only competition? Because here was cooperation. And believe it or not, back in the day, cooperation was a dirty word. Cooperation implied systems measuring and understanding each other that weren't using the human brain to do so. And only the human brain could do that. Only the human brain could evaluate and perceive the nature and look at these things and perform the kind of activities, make the rational, willful decisions to do this. Will only existed in human beings. It could not exist in nature. Will, destiny, all that stuff, verboten, non-dogma, can't go there. And yet it was happening over and over and over again. Now, Karl Popper, great philosopher of science, tells us that all you need to destroy a theory is one counterfact. All these counterfacts were piling up, but the theory remained. And it remains to this day. When you are in a class on evolution, they tell you the main impetus of evolution is random mutations leading over time gradually to philosophical change. Let's jump over to another major discipline of importance to Texas, geology. To this day, there are people who believe that all the major trends in geology have to be gradual and have to be, explained by not so much outside forces, but just gradual changes in sedimentation. Sedimentation is perfect for geology in this standard. Barringer Crater in Arizona was once regarded, not by Teddy Roosevelt, but by many geologists, as being a volcanic explosion, a steam explosion that opened up the crater. Why? Because otherwise it was an impact from a giant rock from space, and that was catastrophic. And catastrophism was not allowed because it was biblical. Giant floods in the 1960s, like in the Badlands of Oregon, were not allowed because that was catastrophic. It was Noachian. Noah would have understood this thing. We can't do that. We can't go there. We're science. We're not religion. We cannot have catastrophes. That's what they said in Chelyabinsk. Never happened. Right? Suddenly we have 3 asteroid pass-bys, 1 meteor impact, and wham! We're all very interested again. But Barringer Crater was something about the size of what? 3 aircraft carriers? And it, decimated, it made a huge crater and decimated a large part of the territory. 1908, Siberia, and you know the story. It's all in the newspaper now because something happened in Chelyabinsk, which kind of repeats almost what happened in Siberia in 1908. All of this stuff points toward dogma. being violated by, of all things, nature. How can nature do that? How can science set up a rigid pattern of stuff within which we discipline ourselves and cooperate and get our work done, and then nature comes along and knocks it like 9 pins? What's that about? And the whole point is that dogma has no place in science, except as an organizing principle where your professor tells you, don't be a crackpot just yet, you're not ready for it. But as a doctor on the front lines studying your patients, you've got the chance to do what novelists do, which is to understand the larger patterns of the sociology of the patient, how that affects their medical condition. I'm sure this is a major class in medical school. That the sociology, the politics, the psychology of the patient affects their medicine, and the medicine affects their sociology and their psychology. All of that back and forth takes us around to, you must have a point where you understand the discipline of medicine, of being a doctor, of not testing things out on your patients too much, you know, to where the medical examiner will get after you. But you also have to think about what you're seeing and think for yourself how that affects your larger set of studies, the things you were taught, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're doing fecal transplants. What, bacteria are good for us? Remember back in the 50s when you had to wash your hands every 3 minutes? It's kind of like today, isn't it? Because bacteria were bad for you, germs were bad for you. Germs, got to get rid of germs. You are germs. You are germs inside your cells. You are germs inside your gut. Most of your tissues, most of the living things in you are germs. You're just this shell, this spaceship that carries around germs, right? And the germs protect you to some extent. The germs can cause problems at times, imbalances, all that stuff. It's like, you know, it's like history. You've got history in your gut right now, acting out all the vagaries of history. Viruses. Within your cells, there are things called endogenous retroviruses. They're just part of a small subset of a very large phenomena within your cells where genes are moving around, shifting around, being judged, being deleted, being silenced, all of that stuff. And then you have the top layer of all of that, which we call epigenetics, which probably explains the Chaoborus larva and the phantom midgefly, the Daphne and the Chaoborus. Epigenetics is, if your DNA is a piano, epigenetics is the tune played on the piano. All the stops, all the keys struck, all the keys not struck. Because you can methylate a key, you can put a clamp on a key, and it won't play. And that is something in the last 10 years that wasn't in Darwin's radio, which I'm sad to say wasn't in Darwin's radio, but that adds the top layer to all of this internal churning of DNA within your cells. A cell is a huge factory, far more complex than the biggest Boeing plant up in Everett, not far from where we live. You've got hundreds of thousands of proteins meshed in the cytosol doing these things, and they're being tended to by all these subsidiary machines which are judging them, deleting them, moving them around, folding them, unfolding them, carrying them through membranes, where they have to, unfold them to push them through a membrane and then fold them back up again so they work. Looking at them closely, so if they're folded back up again and they still don't work, their domains aren't exposed or something's not going on, then dissolving them back into subunits and sending them back for starting over again. All of this is going on. The average protein can move and vibrate at around 10,000 hertz. Imagine that. This thing, 60 domains on some large proteins or more. All of them vibrating, doing, working things, 10,000 hertz, 10,000 times a second, doing this in your cell. How many of you have watched cells, live cells in microscopes? Pretty cool. The streaming of the cell is what led early biologists to ask, is that the elan vital, this thing we cannot explain that's going on, these little glinting bits moving through the cell? What is that? What is that? Well, now we know much more about it. We've been able not only to fractionate cells and take a look at them dead, but we've been able to study them while alive. We've been able to do all sorts of studies on cells at the genetic level, at the living level, how they interact in tissues, all of that stuff. And what we see is an immense community of interaction which has very little to do with randomness. The cell can't afford randomness any more than the business can afford randomness. But that doesn't mean randomness doesn't contribute. Randomness is important. because it creates the unexpected novelty. We all know what that's like in the everyday life when something happens that we didn't expect and it changes our lives. That still happens in evolution, but you can't let it take over. A totally random business would not long stay in business. A totally randomized cell just doesn't work at all. The cell is so tightly structured, but imagine now, this tightly structured cell, so self-disciplined, so devoted to its task in a tissue, in an organ of doing this thing, is part of this immense organ, which is also organized. Floods of neurochemistry, floods of hormones, keeping all of these cells in line, and all of this happening all at once, and being coordinated day after day after day to keep you going. You are a tyrant. You are the tyranny of these poor cells, but you got to take care of them. So imagine now that you're not taking care of them. You're putting too much stress on those cells. They're being forced to die and reproduce and go through their genetic cycles more and more often, creating the chance for more and more error, or so perhaps for more and more upset. Maybe they get tired of you after a while. Why are you doing this to us? Why are you putting us under so much stress for no good reason? This isn't natural. Lungs, clogged with smoke, alcohol, too many fats, too many oils, whatever. All of this bothering the heck out of us. Why are you doing this? That's it. We're reading Ayn Rand and we're going to change. We're going to live forever and we're going to reproduce. And they go and metastasize. And suddenly the cell rearranges its chromosomes, rearranges everything, just changes its nature. It goes rogue. It becomes like a House Republican. And bang, it's rugged individualism all the way. And the rest of the body can't stop it because it no longer listens to the cops. It doesn't respond to the apoptotic signals. It says, you're bad, die, die, die. No, it doesn't do that. Instead, it says, we're on our own now. And you have so many problems caused by rugged individualism. Now, that's all a metaphor. I'm not sure many doctors would sit there and go, I don't think I quite agree with all of that. But it works. Because as a doctor, you can say, I understand this now. You didn't treat your cells properly. And they finally had enough. Or you have a genetic proclivity, such that you're just naturally made up of House Republicans, and bang, you're going to be in trouble the rest of your life. Okay? Imagine the balance between working within a tissue, working within the body, being tyrannized and being fed, you hope, sufficiently well to be happy, not being overstressed. Imagine that balance, how delicate that is to the memory you have of back in the day when you were a free-swimming protozoan in the ocean and just had nothing to worry about except your own life, your own existence. How does that apply to what you're doing when you're studying a patient or in a biology lab or whatever? What am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is, here's one of my personal best moments. I was at a DARPA-associated conference in Maryland, and it was early in the morning, and I was to get up and speak for our team, so I was the first one up, and instantly I got in trouble. I started talking about this crackpot theory of mine, which is, you got to think like James Joyce when you're looking at biological systems. You've got to ask, what's its name when it's at home? You've got to do a character study. Use your social brain to understand the patterns that are going on in the biology, because there are social patterns there. And a hand rose up over on one side, and this gentleman is in his late 70s says, I wouldn't totally discount randomness in all of this stuff. Randomness still has a big part to play. Okay. We talked for about 30 seconds. I couldn't do much more than that, and he was not happy with me at all. He was a Nobel Prize winner. I'm an English major. That's a personal best. When I'm sitting there and come out from this discussion and say, okay, the Nobel Prize winner is brilliant, but in this area, I'm right. That's a personal best. So where was I? In terms of these metaphors, what I'm getting at here is your mathematical brain, your rational brain is extraordinarily powerful. It can do amazing things, but it cannot solve the problems of biology. Not as fast as your social brain. Your social brain is there to pick up patterns, to understand relationships, to understand the politics of a system, all the complex stuff. Your social brain basically takes it all in and comes up with answers instantly, because you need to do that kind of work to survive in society. Understanding biology uses the social brain more than it does the rational brain in terms of just, total deductive reasoning. You've got to do something else to understand the large-scale patterns, because you'll never understand it all. Why? Because you're a biological being. As a doctor, in a clinic, in a classroom, learning or doing, you don't have time to get all the facts. You must find patterns. And unlike House, who finds patterns and then makes people suffer until he gets it right, you've got to do it quickly and efficiently and maximize the results. Otherwise, you're probably not going to last very long as a doctor. How do you do that? Studying the patient, asking questions, like a detective. When you're in the laboratory, you are inquiring of these cells. What do you really want to be when you're at home? What do you really want to do? Why are you changing your chromosome structure now? These HeLa cells, why are they able to live forever? What is that about? How does this happen? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it instructive? It's certainly instructive, but all of that plays back into your social brain. So being on the front lines of biology is like being in a war. It's like it's like ignoring the things that don't work anymore without giving up on them completely, because they got you where you are. And that's the larger scale thing about epistemology, about learning, about science, is sometimes the bad disciplines held you down long enough that you could launch into a new area. And they didn't allow you to move over into territories that were useless, because you may not have known enough at some point to avoid those crackpot theories. So if you've seen when rocket launches, Russian rockets launch, they're held down on the pad until they achieve the engine power necessary to launch. And then wham, the hold downs, the tie downs fly aside and the rocket takes off. Bad science, early science, discipline, dogma serve those functions. If I'm confusing you, good. Because learning is biological. You are part of a social system. You are a cell in a larger organism. We like to think of ourselves as rugged individualists. We certainly do behave that way sometimes. But in fact, you are part of a larger system. Everything you do, as John Dewey pointed out, comes clothed in culture. The demands of culture, the requirements of culture, everything that is expected of you is determined by a large number of people, most of whom you've never met. You're a cell. You can read Ayn Rand all you want. You must still participate to the society. You may not become immortal, live forever, and have an infinite number of children and gather up all the resources in the world. You cannot become the perfect libertarian in this society without becoming a tumor. So think of those balances back and forth. The metaphor, the tumor that wants to live forever and reproduce without responsibility, the individual that wants to live forever, the transhumanist that wants to live forever, who doesn't want to be part of the body politic, who doesn't want this, they want complete freedom. What is the metaphor telling us there? Is it bad? Is it good? Well, then they're going to metastasize. Maybe they'll go to Mars. Maybe they'll fly off to Mars and reproduce there. Well, that's fine. That's called reproduction. Human beings are like the gonads for the earth, and so that might work. That might work quite well. Sporulation, that sort of thing. But within our society, immortality, living forever, is a very difficult prospect, because that's what tumor cells do. Now, what tumor cells also do is they're not so organized that they can take care of every tumor cell that they've persuaded to join them in the process. Tumor necrosis is common when you study cancer. Why? Because the persuasion of blood vessels to move in and ensanguinate your mass of tissue, your tumor, is not complete. You're not sophisticated enough anymore. You've changed your genetics enough that you don't know how to be a large multicellular organism. You can only do so much, and so you ensanguinate the outer parts of the tumor, and the inner part starves to death. That's a fascinating prospect, isn't it? It's like punishment for reading too much Ayn Rand. It's like you signed on for this, but they're deceiving you. They cannot do what they claim they can do for you. You are not going to live forever. Most of you are going to die. That's politics. That's history. That's biology. It's medicine. How cool is that when you take a look at these metaphors? So that's kind of where I was going on the, since there are only a few of the pre-med students here, that's where I'll kind of end on that issue, is you are looking at some of the most amazing stuff in science and biology and medicine that we've ever seen. You are living in an era where every time you open up a medical journal or read an issue of Nature or Science News or whatever, I don't know about you, but my jaw drops. So we're finding out little RNAs are now part of this whole process of organizing the cell. They are part of the genetic transfer of information within the cell. We're learning more and more about all the regulatory fixes within the cell, and that is where medicine is going to be. Within the tissues, within the cells, within the individuals, all of this stuff. Use metaphors, use your social brain. You will never understand all of this stuff with just the upper brain, because you've got a big engine that studies large-scale structures so that you will fit in and get access to resources. And that's where your grants are going to work out, is when you figure out how these things work and who they are when they're at home. Now, why is a science fiction writer telling you this? I'm an English major. I don't have a PhD. But back around the 1990s, as I was reading Lynn Margulis and parsing all my doubts about how evolution actually worked and all that sort of thing, I started telling myself, I think I know how it works. I'm beginning to understand how it works. Bacteria use lysogenic phage to transfer material. They use phages. Lysogenic phage kill the bacteria, but there are also latent phages which embed the genetic material inside the bacteria. And many diseases that we are not very happy with, like cholera, are phage-mediated. That is, the phages are viruses, bacterial viruses, actually transfer the genes of toxicity from one bacterial population to another to create, for example, Vibrio cholera out of straightforward harmless Vibrio. You know, the difference between anthrax and between Bacillus thuringiensis is 2 genes. That's it. Both soil bacteria, but at some point, all you got to do is transfer 2 genes from a common gardening bacteria that you sprinkle on your garden to take care of cutworm or whatever, and you've got anthrax. That's all it takes. And sometimes these genes are transferred by viruses. So back in the 1990s, I asked myself, wow, is there anything like that for human beings? For mammals, for larger scale organisms? Because the metaphor works. If nature has it in one place, it's going to have it in another, in one form or another. Well, I couldn't think of anything, so I said, okay, I'll have to invent this then. For Darwin's radio, I'm going to need a genetic complement that is a virus that is a FedEx for genes in human beings and carries them between populations. Okay, I'm going to have to do that. And then 2 weeks later, because the internet was not that powerful back then, there wasn't a lot of material online in the early 1990s, I found human endogenous retroviruses. I had taken a metaphor, applied it from one natural phenomena, sought for it in another area, and boy, when you have a crackpot discover something amazing. Based upon his predilections, that was bad news. And so that's what became Darwin's radio. The notion that what are viruses doing for us? Viruses are, in fact, FedEx for genes, sometimes for the good, sometimes not for the good, but that's what they do. They do it for all of us. Viruses carry within our cells, there are retrotransposons, which can move genes around, and they can be very, very important. You have color vision now because of a retrotransposon event millions of years ago. Back when dinosaurs were chasing mammals around, the mammals had to hang out at night, and so they kind of lost their third color vision for a while. Some of them regained it later when a color cone gene was duplicated by a retrotransposon event. So you had 3 color coding genes working at once. That was in the monkeys and in some other mammals. That event in us leads us to see in 3 colors today. That event was mediated by a duplication of a gene. Not random duplication, or was it? If it was entirely beneficial. But what was it? It was like a toolbox was being accessed because now we were out in the daylight and we could use color more efficiently. So we regained what we had lost. It had been held back because it wasn't necessary for a while. You had a reserve, a resource that you didn't need, and it was kind of costing you, maybe, by distracting you with color that you didn't need at night, being chased by all these little meat-eating dinosaurs. Gained it back when you needed it. Like the wing insect, the stick insect that gains its wings, like Chiabrus doing this stuff. The DNA is an immense toolbox of prior evolution that has been stored up for access on levels and on ways that you can't even imagine. Not just major changes physiologically, but when you're running, you switch over to anaerobic mechanisms, which are ancient. and you are accessing another part of your metabolism, which may not be so much, actually genetically mediated, as available to you now. What happens if you run a lot? Then your body changes. You start accessing and opening up other parts of your DNA. You change the way your body operates. When you do certain things mentally, physically, you are accessing a genetic toolbox at an early level. But as things move on, as you start unclamping methylated genes, as you start opening up stored and mothballed genes, you are able to do so many different things with the DNA that you are given now without changing the sequence. You do not have to change sequence to do all of this. And changing sequence was, under the old dogma, the only way you could have evolutionary change. You had to actually change the sequence of the DNA, one bit at a time. Turns out that's not the way it works. Sometimes it does, but that's not the way it works. Most of the time, out of all of these possible mutations, so many get wiped out, ignored, clamped, corrected, that sort of change would require hundreds of trillions of years to evolve a new, interesting form of life. Instead, what you've got is you evaluate your environment, you build up your toolbox, you add genes, which let you do this, genes that can sometimes be zipped together, compressed, folded together, so you can't even tell what they are anymore. So that you have one gene that butts up against another, and you read to the end of a reading frame in one gene, and then you take at the beginning before that reading frame and it reads off another gene, and suddenly you have combinations of genes. You have junk DNA. There is no such thing, really. Junk DNA is regulatory DNA, and it's basically mothballed DNA. You have all these things wrapped up and tightly condensed in your DNA clusters that you don't access on an everyday basis, but you could under certain circumstances. You are a huge population with another mind helping you understand what needs to be done in the DNA, and that mind is your radar system, which is your immune system. Your immune system is a second brain. Sometimes you can feel it operating because you feel sick or whatever. Sometimes you don't even notice it at all. But it's there, it's checking out your environment, and it's setting up levels of hormones, cortisols, all of these stress-inducing hormones, and those stress-inducing hormones start retrotransposons and sometimes viruses operating in your DNA to shift things around. How many of you going from a warm environment to a cold environment have a 24-hour period where suddenly, bang, you don't feel so good? You're down and out for 24 hours, feverish, etc., and then you wake up and it's fine. You have just adjusted your entire body to a new environment. How the hell does that happen? I don't think it's even studied. May not be a virus. Maybe it is. You're a doctor. You tell us. You observe your patients. You do this. You start making notes in your head. Eventually, you may have an idea, and you may know it more than we do. As a science fiction writer, nobody really cares what I think. There are no grant doctors saying, you lose your money because you're a crackpot. There's nobody up there who can shut me down, shut my research down, and so I'm a rogue element. But I'm a rogue element that because when I wrote Darwin's Radio, I made damn sure I knew nearly everything I needed to know and put it into that book. Suddenly biologists started writing to me and saying, here's my paper. Have you read this paper? And that's cool. Wow, that's really cool. Here's this other guy's paper. Come take a look over here. Here's Louis P. Villarreal, who's the head of virology at UCI. And Louis P. Villarreal believes that pregnant women produce endogenous retroviruses, HERV. They're not actually capable of infecting anybody, but they produce them in huge numbers. Why? Because they have a foreign body in their body. Now, they have a fetus in their body. And the HERV helps subdue the mother's immune system internally so it doesn't attack. That's HERV doing what it's supposed to do. But transfer HERV, ERV from one species to another and you have AIDS. Maybe from a chimpanzee, maybe from an ape. Who knows how that happened? Bushmeat, who knows how it happened. But the HIV virus has a perhaps beneficial effect in its host species, its actual host species. That's weird. That's creepy. We wouldn't get born without viruses, quite literally. So that's what viruses do for us. Since I'm a crackpot and admit it openly, I get to hang out with some of the very finest scientists around. One of my great honors was to be asked by Lynn Margulis herself to provide quotes to help promote her books. That's cool. And now her son, Dorian Sagan, is writing more books, and I'm reading his books, and he's very bright also, and writes great books. His mother is no longer with us. So I'm going to end on the note of, if you're talking about feminism and values in science, the best biologists of the 20th century quite often were women. Barbara McClintock, who discovered jumping genes in corn. She wasn't that good at expressing herself in scientific papers, so it was kind of hidden for a while. But back in the 1970s, a friend of mine was driving her from one event to another, and she says, you know, the genome, it's like a jungle, she says. It's like an ecosystem. There's so much going on there. The genome as an ecosystem was a huge insight, which she had and probably didn't want to fight to convey. Carl Woese, who came up with the notion of many different kingdoms, the archaea, for example, he was heavily knocked down. And they tried to kick him out of the department. They tried to do everything they could because he was breaking dogma. Later on, he becomes justified, becomes famous. But meanwhile, what would have happened if there had been a more rational approach to what he was telling them? Lynn Margulis, mitochondria are bacteria? What? That's cooperation. We don't allow cooperation. It has to be competition only. Symbiosis is silly. It's stupid. There were literally in the 1970s universities in England that would fire you if you studied symbiosis because it was not competition. Competition, red of fang and claw, that's what evolution is. It's not cooperation. Well, now that seems so ridiculous. In an age of ecology and studies and interactions, it was ridiculous in the 1920s. It was ridiculous in the 1860s. Darwin did not think this way. Darwin did not consider such a pure form of his theory of evolution to be operating. Why? Because his metaphor was evolution is like a farmer selecting out farm animals. Okay, that implies will. That implies something. And he wasn't willing to say it was God. And so we got where we are now. And it wasn't God necessarily, but you can't prove that. The dogmas have gotten so rigid between science and religion that they can hardly talk to each other anymore. Because the scientist screams bloody murder. You have some scientist over here, some would-be scientist saying, there is no God, you know? And then there's the other, it's all God, all the time. In between lies this mysterious area of, you don't know that, but you can't prove it scientifically one way or the other, so it's not within the purview of science to discuss this. It's a personal thing. Don't say God did this. Maybe he did, but you can't prove it because you can't take God out of the equation. You can't remove God from the system. You can't do a test without God. So you don't know that. You cannot check that out. Why do you arrogantly insist? If you're a religious person, you say God does it all, then you say, you mean you have no free will? What if you're not the only creature in creation that has free will? What if God allows free will through all of nature to find its way, to solve its problems, for his infinite amusement, for his bemusement, for his love, for whatever? How is that not a beautiful picture? How are you not looking at the fingers of God as being the laws of science? How can you not make that metaphor? Because you think rigidly, you think dogmatically, you think of, back and forth, of red of fang and claw, of argument rather than of thinking things through. But you also aren't thinking clearly. Because science is about what we can study here, we can test, we can replicate. Religion is about those things that aren't covered by science. And if you want to play with them and mess with them in your personal life, that's fine. You have to think 6 impossible thoughts before breakfast to be a human being. You have to keep these things in balance. You have to keep them in tension all the time because your brain, your philosophy, your science is a toolbox you are drawing from to solve problems, just like the DNA has all these multiple toolboxes it can draw from. They contradict because one protein, if you trot this protein out and mix it up with another protein, they won't get along, they'll fight, they'll die, they'll kill each other. Bang, don't bring them out at the same time unless it's strictly necessary because that's going to be the cusp of a new paradigm, a new revolution, and changes. And that's why we get old and die. Because sometimes the only way you can change science is to have old scientists go away. And for all of you students here, that's got to be the most encouraging way to end this talk. Thank you very much for your time.
We have some time for questions, and Magda will have the microphone. So if you want to raise your hand.
You didn't record this, did you? Because, boy, I could lose my grant money if this got out.
Well, thanks for one of the most brilliant talks I've ever heard.
Well, thank you very much.
And I've heard a lot. I wanted to ask you if you'd run across this whole term in sociobiology of spandrels.
Not in a long time. Remind me what they are.
Well, the idea, this was what Stephen Jay Gould is also Lewontin and also Pinker.
Okay.
And they were trying to explain things like art and religion as being like spandrels. And spandrels are if you're going to support a dome on a set of arches, it means you've got these useless sort of curved triangular bits,
right,
which are not actually doing anything. They're not really functional, but they sort of come along as sort of byproducts of things which are actually useful.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, it was an attempt, I think, again, to avoid the idea of design.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have to have a designer, as you say, to have design.
Right.
But design is a sort of dirty word.
Yeah, it is.
What you seem to be saying, it seems to me, is that, for instance, all that junk DNA, all of the unexpressed genes, all of this viral potential inside us, that in a sense it's all spandrels, and spandrels are in fact extremely useful. They are in fact the future of the organism.
If you vibrate the dome wrong, the spandrel could be very helpful, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, if the wind hits that dome, God only knows what will happen. We all have our class prejudices. Scientists believe science is the most important thing. Artists believe art is the most important thing. Politicians believe they should support the arts and sciences and keep them at a distance whenever possible. And universities try and keep all of these things happily together. Well, when you're a philosopher, you're going to be supporting your class system above all else. So art and literature is very pretty and very amusing, but not essential. Except when you're in the dark, trying to avoid staying into trouble, getting into trouble. You don't have to go get food or whatever. You don't have to go out. So what are you doing? You're thinking. You're drawing on the cave wall, okay? And then as you draw on the cave wall, you go, we could use this to communicate things. We could use this to pound into those dense young people the certain rituals they need to go through, A, to pay attention to us as the leaders, and B, to catch animals to feed the tribe. So art comes along, and then you have people drawing naked women up over the walls and all that kind of stuff, which is what men do. And then you have the Venuses. Then you have the Venuses, which all the men carry around in little pouches, and clearly they're religious symbols. Clearly they're not Playboy magazine. So all of this stuff is about supporting your class. When you are a doctor, a writer, and a scientist, and a social scientist, you are more like an anthropologist. You're not trying to justify your existence. You're there to study what's going on. You're there to figure out what its name is when it's at home and what it does. And so art is A, a way of keeping us out of trouble. B, it's a way of communicating social standards. It's a way of communicating things we couldn't possibly experience. Like if you read a great novel, you're going through emotions that maybe you don't want to have to experience in real life. But then you have an insight into it, which you can apply when those emotions start impinging on you. If you're doing art, if you're studying art, then your brain is being fed things that, I don't quite know what that means. What's going on here? And it's being kept exercised, even though there's no danger. So art is life without danger. Art is experience without having lived through it. And all that stuff is part of this social matrix that we live in that informs us. So basically, most of our metaphors come from not what we've experienced, but what other people have experienced. That's what education is all about. So, yes, sir.
Hold
on. You worked science and the use of the term dogma over pretty hard. And I have to really take serious disagreement with your use.
Okay.
I think it was probably Francis Crick who worked with Watson, the DNA structure, who called DNA to RNA to protein the central dogma of molecular biology. He didn't even know at the time that dogma was a term reserved for religious expression.
Absolutely.
Scientists they will come to conclusions, but they're always temporary, pending additional experimentation. So you cannot call that dogma. It's the best statement of what we understand at a given moment in history.
Ideally, absolutely. And in fact, I think he actually meant it humorously. Unfortunately, the people who followed on from him did not. The people who were taught the central dogma in university up until just a few years ago, even today, believed it and followed through on it. So when Howard Timmon had to get his approval going for retroviruses, he was told it doesn't work that way. It violates the central dogma. I asked a major biologist, Brian Mayhew, this issue because another biologist disagreed with me on that assessment that we were held back from understanding HIV because of this. This feeling that retroviruses couldn't really exist as such and couldn't be practical if they were. Another gentleman who's a very good biologist and a science fiction fan says, no, I don't think that's the way it was at all. So I asked Brian Mayhew, who used to be a biologist, a virologist at the CDC, and he says, oh yes, he says, that's absolutely how it happened. That's how Howard went through the trauma of trying to get this through. You have to watch your language. You cannot be playful and childlike all the time when you're in power and you're a Nobel Prize winner, because people will take you seriously. Even smart people will take you seriously. And I think you're right. I think Francis Crick really was being kind of satirical and childlike and you know, reaching out and doing this thing. And both him and Watson were famous for being kind of loose cannons that way. And Crick went on to do studies on extraterrestrial biology and all that sort of stuff, really cool stuff. And Watson went on to continue to be the brilliant son of a bitch that he always was. So we have all of these backs and forths that we have to deal with. And the story is the story of human beings. Science is an activity done by human beings. And as such, hubris comes into it, and sometimes tragedy comes into it. And then there's reversal, and there's triumph. And Lynn Margulis and Carl Woese and Timmon, who didn't live long enough to see it all of these people were justified. But that's okay, because when you're working into a stiff headwind, it gives drama to your life, it gives flavor to your life, it makes your biography more interesting. You have to choose your enemies carefully. If you have the right enemies, your life is wonderful. If you have terrible enemies, nothing good happens. If you have great opposition in the department, you can rise above it and feel triumphant, like Conan, right? This is how Conan the Scientist got his grant money, was by being right after all. All of that stuff, I agree with you on that. Francis Crick was joking. Jokes have consequences in science. As Darwin would find out later on, when Dobzhansky and others took his ideas and turned them into the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis and said, this is where we are. Darwin never fixed it that well. He says, I don't understand how a variation occurs per se. It might be randomness. It could all be randomness. I don't know. Dobzhansky came in and says, it is randomness. Why? Because he was going up against Stalin's biologist, who was also a Ukrainian, Lysenko. Lysenko was saying, acquired traits. You can train the wheat to grow, great. Stalin believed him. People starved. Dobzhansky was so ashamed of this, I suspect, that he went back and says, no, we're not going to do acquired traits. No more Lamarckianism. No more Lysenko. That's bad. None of that. Lamarckianism, in its pure form, is wrong. Traits are acquired, lost, and reacquired all the time in biology. It's the war. It's the battle. It's magnificent. It's our history. And the little bits and details of it are not only worth, many novels, but also a lot of A&E specials. There's a lovely video from about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, with Jeff Goldblum as Watson, I believe, and I forget the guy's name who was Crick, and Rosalind Franklin. A fabulous story, which they did fairly accurately. I think it was based on a play. And Rosalind Franklin was this hardworking, intelligent woman who believed in X-ray crystallography, studied it, did all of these things, and she sort of gave them the material without realizing it, while being romanced by her mentor, which she was not up for, etc. All this back and forth, all this human back and forth. There's one moment in that play which brings tears to my eyes. where she walks into the room alone, where Watson and Crick have set up the double helix model. And she just walks in there, and she looks at it, and all the resentment fades away, and she says, so that's what it looks like. Utterly magnificent. You know, she was a scientist. Her thing was, okay, above all the hurly-burly, above all the irritation of these gadfly scientists, above all this lack of acknowledgement and everything, and I'm not going to die, and I'm not going to get a Nobel Prize because I'm going to die too early, she gets to see what the double helix looks like. That's great. That's biology. That's art.
Mr. Bear, we recently read Blood Music, or the short story version, in our class, and I was curious if the microchips were based off of nanobots, and if the merging of Gale and Edward was kind of a reference to the idea of the Grey Goo event, where basically nanobots become too powerful and they effectively just like take over.
Wonderful question. Gives me a chance to really get egotistical here. When Blood Music, the short story, was written, nanotechnology did not exist. Eric Drexler was working on it, and he may have used the term, but he hadn't written his book, 85 or 86. I think my novel actually comes out before his book even. The novel carries it a step further and gets really weird. The concept of nanotechnology started off as a mechanical silicon-based concept of little machines, like Richard Feynman saying, machines making smaller machines. Feynman came up with that concept. Drexler ran with it and says, eventually we'll have a silicon-based society where all these little machines, computationally, will create smaller and smaller machines. My whole notion was, no, we've already got that. They're called proteins, right? So forget all the silicon stuff. Nanotechnology is living technology. It's protein technology. And that turns out to be the more easily adaptable form of that. When I wrote Blood Music, it was based upon a piece published in New Scientist in 1982, which talked about biochips, where they would send little silicon chips with chemical factories built into them through your bloodstream to gather data. And suddenly I'm going, wait a minute, biochips, wait a minute, DNA is like a computational system. It's a self-organizing computational system. Well, that means that Isaac Asimov is wrong, and you could have a very small intelligence, because the DNA could be the brain. What if the DNA is the brain of the cell? What if it's the creative principle of the cell? And what if you can harness that and give the cell freedom and say, bang, I was off. And Grey Goo happens. But you've also got trillions and trillions of intelligences discovering themselves and taking over. So it's democracy in action, which is really creepy, right? You don't want, anyway, they worship us, so that's great. In the novel, hardly anybody dies, and everyone is transported to a land where they are, in fact, slime, but they're happy slime, okay? So Bruce Sterling wrote to me and says, I can't wait for that to happen. And that was the whole cyberpunk, revolution there. So Blood Music was in part cyberpunk, was prior to nanotechnology, and I love to get together with Eric because we don't disagree as to who invented it. He invented nanotechnology, that's great. I invented Grey Goo. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry,
oh, okay, over here.
Sorry, yeah.
The wand of power.
So as I was growing up, I was spiritual, but I also ran into a lot of science that really made sense to me. Evolution was one of them.
Sure.
And I really resented the idea that they weren't mutually exclusive.
That was weird, wasn't it?
I don't like it. So it was really refreshing to hear you talk about it. And less than a year ago, I read War of the Worlds for the first time, and I posted something online about how I loved how H.G. Wells sort of played with the idea that religion and biology could, defeat these things and that they work together almost, because that's how I read into it. Yeah. So I posted this online, and I got a lot of feedback from other people. Some people saying, that they were upset about it because God's not real. They wouldn't even humor the idea, and that upset me. But then the other problem was that I have friends that are like extreme biblical interpretists that they say that if the Bible, if the evolution can't be real because it's not biblical.
The Bible is inerrant.
Yeah, right. And so I guess my problem is that a lot scientists once an idea becomes too obvious, then they can't deny it anymore, and that does happen in religion too.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I guess my question is, you're trying to get people to break out of these dogmas, and some of the people that I talk with, the Bible forces them to, to believe in it, and to not believe in anything else. Whereas like science, yes, it can fall into dogma, but the base part of it is not to be dogmatic. So how would you break through these people?
Nobody owns science or the facts, and nobody owns God. They only have opinions. And God may or may not agree with them. If the facts don't agree with them, they're in trouble. What happens when God disagrees with you, I have no idea. But I have a feeling that, that the ultimate answer is that you are your own person, you have free will, you can decide. And you can be persuasive and polite, or not, depending on the degree of relationship to them, how important they are, the amity between you is, and all that stuff. We don't need to keep everybody enlightened. Sometimes it's polite to keep our crackpottery to ourselves. But on the other hand, you are free to think what you want. And that God gave us. Free will. Yes. Who's got the wand? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, it's working. Well, you had commented earlier about a lot of dogma going back to the Middle Ages. In the 2000s, I studied on my own a lot of church history and came across the unfortunate history that the medical profession as we know it actually originated in the Church of Rome in the 13th century and was founded by the same pontiff who started the Inquisition and the witch hunts, which was Innocent III. And this is an unfortunate history that we have to fight constantly to overcome.
Which, by the way, you will find in our 3-volume novel, Mongoliad, published by 7 writers, and Neil Stevenson and me. We deal with the 13th century, the Mongolian invasion, and the popes. And the
I'll have to read that.
Yeah.
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But actually, medicine goes back even before that. It goes back to the Greeks and the Arabs.
Well, those people were well burned at the stake.
For just one more question. Make it a good one.
Yes, you must sum it all up for me.
What's your favorite color? No, I'm just kidding. So I'm not.
You're confusing me with Tony Roberts here. I'm sorry. It's not going to work.
I'm not a pre-med student or anything, but I've always been fond of. Well, I've always thought it was cool. In science fiction, we've always seen the idea of somewhere down the future, whether it's disease or dismemberment or something, will either replace, a body part or cure something that's wrong with us with either technology or something biological.
Sure.
And I always post on things like that. I find it really fascinating. I think, recently I think UTD's homepage had something about like some kind of nano yarn that like holds like 1,000 pounds or something like that. And I'm like, oh my God, we can have Terminator muscles, But everybody's like,
or space elevators.
That too, which that would be amazing. But anyways, I guess, I have a lot of people who kind of, they argue with me like that's not right, because this could enable us to essentially, maybe one day with stem cells and who knows, nano yarn, we could find a way to perhaps live forever. What if stem cell research finds the way to cure cancer, cure basically everything?
Sure.
There's all these cases. I think they brought like a essentially dead liver back to life, just kind of pumping it with like, I guess, blood full of stem cells. They've I think in Europe, somewhere in Europe, and I'm sorry, this might just be weird internet facts, which aren't facts, but they found a way to like basically essentially kind of cure a person's diabetes by building them a new pancreas out of their own stem cells and then replacing the old one. And I'm like, do you think we as humans would maybe find a way to essentially live forever? Or do you think that'll be shot down by whether it's, just people who have like the religious disagreement, or perhaps just, overcrowding the
or economics.
Or that.
I think that's a really good question, and I really don't know. What we have here is the Frankenstein paradigm, right? Except in this case, what they're doing is they're taking a matrix, not a dead liver, which is a lot of material you don't need anymore, but they take a matrix and they take cells that come from a liver, stem cells that can grow into liver cells, and they organize on the matrix and can help create, if you structure the matrix properly, a kind of liver which can then be transplanted. And pancreases and all this stuff and all of these different organs, turns out these cells like to get together and party. They like to do it efficiently. They like to be encouraged to do it. And if you do that and give them the proper instructions, then they can recreate some of these organs. Whether you can grow your limb again depends on, what you're doing. But already we have things God wot not of us to do, or whatever the medieval phrase would be. The fact is that we are always doing medical procedures now that were impossible 400 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. Liver transplants have only been around for some time. I have a friend who is now alive because of a liver transplant. Okay? That's amazing. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to live forever, but it does mean you'll be healthier. So we don't know how aging actually works. We find out things like the shortness of your telomeres on your genes indicates you might be susceptible to viruses. And telomeres can be reduced by age or they can be reduced by genetics. So if you get older, viruses start to take you out. But if you replace your telomeres, does that dilute the viruses that are not taking you out? How many mechanisms do we have to go through to avoid dying, to live forever biologically without turning into like a wrinkled old mummy that scares everybody? How are we going to do that? I don't know. It's an adventure. It's a huge question, which I don't have the answer for.
Okay. Now, before we thank Greg Baer, I just want to say a couple of things. First, I want to express my annoyance. You come here with your crackpot theories, and you express them in these damn books that are, by the way, for sale outside. Heresy. So, just a couple of things for those of you who enjoyed this evening. I want to remind you that on March 20th, Wednesday evening here, Dr. Wendy Harpham will speak about preserving compassion in modern medicine, the promise of healthy survivorship. She's a fascinating speaker and a wonderful individual. Now, for those of you who, like me, were totally annoyed by tonight and would like a different kind of speaker, you can find on the page Why Contribute. You should think about becoming a supporter of the Center for Values and become a lobbyist for a different kind of speaker. Now, for those of you who liked tonight, you should give us money and we will bring the same kind of speaker.
I don't know, with a track record like this, only half of that makes sense. So.
Anyway, this was a wonderful evening. This is just what we hope the Center for Values will be. I want to thank Magda Groman and Sabrina Starneman, who did so much to make it successful, and Greg Baer for being amazing. Thank you all.